They didn't just try to stop the movie, they tried to erase the man who made it.
Everyone was told, from Rupert Murdoch, from Fox, to every studio, look, if you touch this thing, you will be out, you will be done. You'll be finished in 3 years.
That was round 1, and Hollywood lost. Now round 2 has been announced, and this time they're showing the devil's face.
To start with the fall of the angels, right?
Yeah.
Which is you're in another place. You're in another realm. You know, you need to go to hell. You need to go to Sheol.
Hell, Satan, the fall of the angels, on a big screen, from the same man they couldn't stop last time.
Did anyone just see that? Anyone just see what that guy did? Can't let that guy do that again. And
yeah,
we don't want anyone doing that. You know, because it sort of walked around the entire system.
They said that after part 1. Now imagine what they're saying behind closed doors about part 2. But here's what nobody is connecting. Let's set the record straight before we go any further. Hollywood didn't just dislike The Passion of the Christ. They didn't just pass on it, roll their eyes, and move on. What happened to Mel Gibson in the early 2000s was something far more deliberate, far more coordinated, and far more revealing about how power actually works in that industry than most people have ever been willing to say out loud. This was a full-scale institutional burial attempt, and it almost worked. Go back to where this started. Mel Gibson was not a nobody. He wasn't some first-time director with a dream and an iPhone. This was an Academy Award winner, a man who had delivered Braveheart, a film that swept the Oscars, that still sits among the most celebrated epics ever put to screen. He had credibility. He had relationships. He had earned the right, by every metric Hollywood uses, to walk into any room and be taken seriously. And none of it protected him the moment he announced what he was making.
There was like Hollywood resistance. People didn't like that you were making it.
There was a lot of opposition to
Almost. That word, almost. Gibson catches himself there because what he's describing is not a polite disagreement between creative people. It's organized resistance, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that works through silence. Unreturned calls, postponed meetings, colleagues who suddenly had other priorities, and it went all the way to the top.
Well, Rupert Murdoch said, you know, he wanted to, and then he said, nah. And then somebody advised him and said he'd be out of business in 5 years. Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch. Let that name sit for a second. Not some mid-level studio executive hedging his bets. Rupert Murdoch, the man who built an empire on controversy, who made billions off provocative content, who never once in his career shied away from something because it might make people uncomfortable, privately warned that distributing Mel Gibson's film about Jesus Christ would destroy his business within 5 years. That is not a financial calculation. That is a threat dressed up as advice. And Murdoch walked away. And when Murdoch walked, every major studio read the room and followed, because that's how this system works. Not through public declarations, through quiet consensus, through a shared understanding that some stories are simply not welcome.
Christianity is the one religion that you're allowed to disparage.
Yeah.
Christianity is the one religion where people, they'll embrace all these different religions until it comes to Christianity.
That double standard, right there, that is the beating heart of everything Gibson was navigating. An industry that congratulates itself endlessly on its openness, on its diversity of stories, on its courage to tell difficult truths systematically, quietly deciding that one particular story, the central story of 2 billion people on the planet, was too much, too dangerous, too sincere, too real. And so Gibson was left alone with his vision, his conviction, and a checkbook he was about to drain entirely. Now here's the part of this story that people underestimate, because when we talk about the Passion of the Christ and the war Gibson fought to make it, we tend to focus on Gibson himself, the self-financing, the studio rejections, the box office vindication. But there was another man paying a completely different kind of price at the same time. A man who didn't have Gibson's financial resources, who didn't have his awards, who didn't have his decades of industry standing to fall back on. A man who had everything still ahead of him and bet it all anyway. Jim Caviezel.
It was just a big close-up of Caviezel. And there was something otherworldly and childlike going on there in the close-up. And I thought, who's that guy? He's amazing.
That's how Gibson found him. A single close-up from Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line. Something in that shot stopped Gibson cold, a stillness, a presence, something he couldn't name. And he knew this was the face. But before Caviezel could even process what Gibson was offering him, before the excitement of being chosen for the role of a lifetime could fully register, Gibson's team sat him down and told him the truth.
Remember this one conversation I had with Mel Gibson and the whole team that came in? and just said, wow, these are the stakes. My team split.
His own team split. The people paid to protect his career couldn't agree on whether this was survival or suicide. Half said walk away. Half said you can't walk away from this. And Caviezel had to stand in the middle of that division, call his wife, and decide who he was. He said yes.
The moment I took it, the phone stopped ringing.
Just like that. Not a slow fade, not a gradual cooling of relationships. The moment. Immediately. The industry made its decision at the speed of a closed door, and Caviezel walked onto that set in Italy knowing full well what he had given up, and he did it anyway. What happened to him there is the part of this story that never fully makes it into the mainstream coverage, because the physical price Caviezel paid on that set was not symbolic. It was not cinematic. It was real, documented, and in at least one case, nearly fatal. The cross he carried weighed over 150 pounds. During one take, it dislocated his shoulder, completely pulled it right out of the socket. During the scourging scenes, real whips struck him. Not props, not controlled stage work. Twice with enough force to break skin and knock the breath out of him entirely. And he refused to stop. Between takes, the crew would find him in the dirt, lips moving, face streaked with blood that was not entirely from makeup. The Roman soldiers hired as extras men who came to the set as professionals started weeping during the crucifixion scenes and couldn't say why. Not one bird. You can explain away a lot on a film set. Tired actors, long days, emotional material, method performance. But a valley going completely silent during the crucifixion? Not one crew member who was present that day has ever fully explained what that stillness felt like. Most of them don't try. And then came the lightning. There are things that happen on film sets all the time. Equipment fails, weather rolls in, accidents happen, schedules collapse. These are the unglamorous realities of production that never make it into the promotional material. And then there are things that happen that nobody has a clean category for. The lightning strikes on the set of The Passion of the Christ fall into that second category. Not because lightning is supernatural. Lightning is weather. But the specific pattern of what happened, who it hit, when, and what those people did afterward is something that the people who were present still have difficulty explaining in ordinary terms.
The Passion, well, was struck by lightning.
Jim Caviezel, struck by lightning while portraying Jesus Christ on a hillside in Italy, hanging on a cross. While the cameras were rolling, the crew around him scattered, equipment burned, and when the smoke cleared, Caviezel was still on the cross.
The wind was blowing, and then I couldn't hear the wind. And I could feel the suctioning occur. And then it was probably more like 3 seconds. It felt like 5, but it was probably less than that. And then boom. I was in shock. I died on the operating table. I've never told that, but I died. The reason why I brought that up is I felt incredible peace and love that's waiting for us.
He had never said those words publicly before that moment. He died on an operating table, years after the film, as a direct consequence of injuries sustained during production. And what he described when he came back, the peace, the love, the certainty of something waiting, is the kind of testimony that doesn't leave a room quickly. And Caviezel was not alone in the lightning. Assistant director John Michelini was struck twice on the same production, 2 separate incidents, the same man. And his response was not to lawyer up or go to the press or quit the industry. His response was to conclude that his life needed to change. And it did, completely.
I found him in a Fiat Bambino with his knees up around his ears, like waiting for the third strike. He was like, this just doesn't happen twice in the third strike. And he says, I have to change my life.
2 lightning strikes, the same man, on the same production. And his response was not to sue, not to quit, not to go to the press. His response was to conclude that his life needed to change. And it did.
2 lightning strikes, 1 man, 1 production, about Jesus Christ. You can call that coincidence. You can call it weather patterns and bad luck. But the people standing on that hill in Italy that day don't call it anything. They just get quiet when you bring it up. And then the cross itself. During one of the most violent storms to hit the set, lightning struck the hillside repeatedly. Crew members dove for cover. Equipment was destroyed. And when the chaos cleared, the wooden cross at the center of the scene stood untouched. Not a mark on it. Not a single ember.
Crew members shouted, equipment burned. And when the smoke cleared, the wooden cross stood untouched. Not a mark. Not a single ember.
Mel Gibson has never offered a clean explanation for any of it. Not the cross, not the lightning, not the silence in the valley, not the weeping extras, not the sound technician who swore he could still hear something in the old film reel's faint whispers, like prayers caught in static. God worked through it. 7 words. The full extent of Gibson's public explanation for events that crew members still can't categorize 2 decades later, because some things, as one crew member put it, lose their holiness when dissected. So, the studios said no. Rupert Murdoch was warned off. Caviezel's phone went dead. The set was struck by lightning multiple times. The distributor they finally found was, in Gibson's own words, just a toothless dog and a fax machine and an assistant. That was the entire apparatus standing between the Passion of the Christ and complete commercial burial. And Gibson went around every closed door.
And I got these messages back. All the majors wouldn't distribute it. So I was like, nobody will distribute it. Okay, I guess I've lost, the money, but it was worth the experience.
He had already made peace with losing everything, already accepted the possibility that this film might never reach a single theater. And from that place of complete surrender, he picked up the phone and started calling theater owners directly. Handshake deals. No studio middleman, no industry apparatus, just a man and a film and owners who said yes.
Anyone just see that? Anyone just see what that guy did? Can't let that guy do that again. And we don't want anyone doing that, because it sort of walked around the entire system.
That recording, that moment, somebody in Hollywood, behind closed doors, genuinely alarmed. Not angry, not dismissive, alarmed. Because what Gibson had just done wasn't just make a successful film. He had demonstrated publicly, undeniably, with receipts that the system could be bypassed entirely. $612 million on a $30 million budget, the highest grossing R-rated film in American history, a record it held for 20 years, the highest grossing independent film ever made, the highest grossing non-English language film ever made. Hollywood had to sit there and watch every single one of those numbers come in. And they had to sit there knowing that they had tried to prevent it, that they had coordinated across studios, across distribution companies, across media empires, to make sure this film didn't exist, and the only thing they had accomplished was making Mel Gibson richer and more dangerous than he was before. Because now he knew something they couldn't take back. He knew the map. He had proved that you can self-finance, self-distribute, make handshake deals with theater owners, walk around the entire apparatus Hollywood spent decades constructing to control which stories reach audiences, and come out the other side with the most successful independent film in the history of cinema. And now, 2 decades later, he's doing it again. Here's where this story stops being about the past and becomes about right now. For years, quietly, deliberately, away from every camera that once pointed at him, Mel Gibson has been working on Part 2. Not a cash grab sequel, not a franchise extension. Something Gibson himself has described as unlike anything he has ever read.
There's a lot required because it is, I'll just tell you this, it's an acid trip when we wrote it. It is like, I've never read anything like it.
An acid trip. Those are Mel Gibson's words. The man who made The Passion of the Christ one of the most serious, most disciplined, most spiritually intense films ever produced, describing his sequel script as something he has never read anything like. That should terrify Hollywood. Because The Passion of the Christ was disciplined. It was focused. It was brutally contained 3 hours in the final days of one man's life. What Gibson is building now is something categorically different in scope.
And my brother and I and Randall all sort of congregated on this, so there's some good heads put together, but there's some crazy stuff. And I think in order to really tell the story properly, you have to start with the fall of the angels, right?
Yeah.
Which is you're in another place. You're in another realm. You need to go to hell. You need to go to Sheol.
The fall of the angels, hell, Sheol, Satan, on a mainstream cinema screen. Written by Mel Gibson, his brother, and Randall Wallace, the man who wrote Braveheart. 3 minds, all operating at the absolute top of their craft, who have spent years constructing a narrative that Gibson says spans from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle, a warm-up act. The film that Hollywood tried to prevent from existing. The film that became the highest grossing independent production in the history of cinema. The film that Rupert Murdoch was told would end his empire. The film that struck its lead actor with lightning and sent its assistant director on a spiritual crisis. That film is the warm-up act, and Caviezel is coming back.
You choose who's going to be the next Jesus.
You use him again.
Caviezel.
Yeah, I know it's
I
20
think so,
years later.
too.
It's 20 years later, but it's
Yeah, but it's the right guy.
yeah, but it's supposed to be 3 days later, but he got 20 years old.
20 years. The man who said yes when every door was closing. The man whose phone went silent the moment he agreed. The man who was struck by lightning, who dislocated his shoulder under a 150-pound cross, who died on an operating table and came back. He's stepping back into that role. And Gibson knows exactly what that means. He knows the CE will handle the age discrepancy. He knows the technology has caught up to the vision. He knows that by the time cameras roll, the tools will be there. What he also knows, and what he said plainly, without drama, almost casually, is exactly what's coming next. He's expecting it. He's not afraid of it. He's not trying to negotiate his way around it or soften the project to make it more palatable to an industry that has already shown him who it is. He is simply, and this is the part that should make Hollywood genuinely nervous planning for it, because the last time he planned for their resistance, he ended up with $612 million and a 20-year box office record. Let's talk about why the panic is different this time. Because it is different, fundamentally. When The Passion of the Christ was being developed, Hollywood could still comfort itself with uncertainty. Maybe it flops. Maybe audiences don't show up. Maybe the controversy kills it at the box office. Maybe the gamble doesn't pay off and Gibson becomes a cautionary tale rather than a proof of concept. That uncertainty is gone now. The proof of concept exists. The record exists. The numbers are in the history books. And the man who produced those numbers just announced he is doing it again with a bigger canvas, a more ambitious story, a returning lead, and a script that he himself describes as unlike anything he has ever read. There is no version of this where Hollywood gets to pretend the first film was an anomaly. And here's the second reason the panic is worse: the content of the sequel. The Passion of the Christ was, at its core, a story about human cruelty and divine suffering. It was brutal, and it was real. And it was the kind of film that made comfortable people deeply uncomfortable, but it stayed on Earth. It stayed inside the familiar framework of the crucifixion narrative that, however confrontational Gibson made it, was at least a story that audiences had some cultural reference point for. The resurrection is something else entirely.
No bad guys?
Well, there are.
Yeah?
They're in another realm. Why are these realms slugging it out for the souls, the hearts and souls of mankind?
Realms, slugging it out for souls. Gibson is not making a gentle theological meditation. He is not making a Sunday school film about an empty tomb and some disciples having breakfast by a lake. He is making a cosmic war film, a spiritual epic that begins before human history and ends after it, that descends into hell, confronts Satan directly, depicts the fall of the angels, and then rises back through the resurrection as the climax of a battle that spans the entire narrative of human existence. And then you factor in the content hell: Satan, the cosmic war, the resurrection, the kind of visionary, boundary-demolishing cinematic ambition that generates cultural conversation whether people love it or despise it. The numbers Hollywood is running on this project privately are not reassuring to them, and it gets worse. Here's the dimension of this story that almost never gets discussed. Because when we talk about Mel Gibson and the Passion of the Christ, and now the resurrection, we talk about Hollywood, we talk about the studios, we talk about the box office, we talk about cultural warfare between faith and an entertainment establishment that has made its biases visible. What we don't talk about enough is the institution that should have been standing beside Gibson from the very beginning and wasn't. That voice, that indictment, that is not coming from a culture critic or a Hollywood outsider. That is a religious leader looking at the institutional church and asking with genuine anguish why two filmmakers had more courage than the people whose entire purpose is supposed to be standing for this story. 30 pieces of silver. The language of betrayal. Deliberate, pointed, unambiguous.
The Lord Jesus is a warrior, the warrior. But unfortunately, the 21st century Christians are weak. Very weak. They sold their master for money.
Sold their master for money. At a moment when Mel Gibson was doing the exact opposite, pouring his own money into a film the entire industry told him would destroy him, elements of the institutional church were silent, comfortable, unwilling to stake their reputations on a story that was supposedly their central reason for existing. Gibson saw this. He lived it. The same pattern he was depicting on screen: religious authorities, more concerned with their positions than with truth, systems designed to protect power rather than people, silence when courage was required. He watched it play out around him in real time. This is the layered tragedy that most people miss when they tell the Passion of the Christ story as a simple Hollywood versus faith narrative. Because Gibson wasn't just fighting Hollywood, he was also looking at institutions that claimed to represent the same faith he was risking everything to portray, and watching them hedge and retreat and protect their social standing rather than stand behind what he was doing. The men who were supposed to be his natural allies were often the quietest voices in the room. And now, with part 2 announced with hell and Satan and the fall of the angels on the table, the same institutions face the same choice again: stand behind the story or protect the comfort zone. And based on recent history, the answer is not guaranteed. But 2 men have already given their answer. 2 men already made their choice before they knew how the story would end. And their names are Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel. There's a reason Joe Rogan's response to the Gibson interview hit differently than almost anything else he's produced. And it's not because Rogan is a Christian. He's not, at least not in any traditional sense. It's not because he's soft on difficult claims. The man has built an empire on skepticism, on demanding evidence, on pushing back on every assertion until it can hold its own weight. The reason it hit differently is that Gibson gave him something he couldn't push back against. Joe Rogan has sat across from presidents. He's talked to war veterans, scientists, billionaires, fighters who have stared death in the face. He does not rattle easily. He is constitutionally built for composure in the presence of extraordinary claims. And then Mel Gibson asked him about the apostles. Every single one tortured, exiled, executed for refusing to say 3 words. We made it up. They had every incentive in the world to say those 3 words. It would have ended the persecution. It would have saved their lives. It was the most rational possible move in a world that was actively trying to kill them for their testimony. And not one of them said it. That's not the behavior of people who know they're lying. Rogan, who has made a career out of demanding evidence, who has built his platform on the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, had no clean answer for that. Not one that held up, not one that worked. And it landed somewhere below argument, somewhere beyond debate, in the place where you stop looking for a counter-argument and start sitting with the weight of what you've just heard. Now imagine what happens when Rogan sits across from Gibson again after part 2, after the film that goes to hell, after the film that shows the fall of the angels, after the film that takes a cosmic war for human souls and puts it on a 40-foot screen with a director who already proved he cannot be stopped. That conversation hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. Expanded, made cosmic. Because this time, it's not just about the suffering. It's about what came after. It's about the moment the stone rolled back. It's about the fall that preceded the salvation the angels who chose wrong, the war in heaven, the descent into darkness, and the light that tore through it. It's about Satan's face on a 40-foot screen, put there by the same director that Hollywood tried to bury 20 years ago and couldn't. Light and darkness never meet quietly. That sentence was written about the first film. It applies to the second with even greater force, because the second film is literally, narratively, cosmically about the meeting of light and darkness, about what happens when the two come into direct collision on the grandest possible scale. Jim Caviezel said yes before he knew what it would cost. He paid the cost anyway. He carried a 150-pound cross, took real whips across his back, was struck by lightning, died on an operating table, and came back. And he's stepping into that role again, 2 decades later, because he believes it's the right guy, because Gibson believes it, because the story is not finished. These are not the behaviors of men who are making career calculations. These are men who believe they are telling a story that needs to be told regardless of what it costs them. And in a world that runs almost entirely on calculation on risk assessment and brand protection and strategic positioning and managed controversy, that kind of conviction is genuinely difficult for an industry built on transaction to process. Hollywood doesn't have a category for it. They had no category for it the first time, and they lost. They had no playbook for a man who was willing to mortgage his house and walk away from the entire distribution system and make handshake deals with theater owners because he believed the story was true and it had to reach people. They don't have a better playbook now, and the man implementing the strategy knows every weakness in their position because he already exploited every single one of them once before. The sequel is coming. Hell is going to be on that screen. Satan's face is going to be in those theaters, and the same quiet machinery that tried to stop part 1 is already turning. The question is whether it will matter. Based on what happened last time, based on $612 million in 20 years of box office records, and a map that every independent filmmaker can now read, the answer to that question should be keeping a lot of very powerful people in Hollywood up at night, because Mel Gibson is not asking for permission this time either. He never was.